The life of Zachery Davis. Zachery Davis was born into what seemed like an average family in Hendersonville, Tennessee. He was the younger of two brothers, living a relatively quiet life with his parents, Chris and Melanie Davis, and his older brother Josh. Hendersonville, a suburban city northeast of Nashville, was a close-knit community where violent crime was relatively rare, making the events that would later unfold even more shocking. As a child, Zachary was known to be quiet and introverted. He preferred spending time alone and was often lost in his thoughts, unlike his older brother Josh, who was more outgoing and sociable. However, the Davis family was struck by tragedy when Chris Davis, the father and pillar of the family, was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, a progressive neurodegenerative disease. Chris's illness was not only a physical and emotional burden on the family, but also a financial one. As his condition worsened, it became clear that his days were numbered. Chris Davis passed away when Zachary was just 9 years old. The death of his father marked a significant turning point in Zachary's life. The loss of a parent is a profound event for any child, but for Zachary, who had already shown signs of introversion and social withdrawal, it was particularly devastating. Chris had been a stabilizing force in Zachary's life, and without him, the boy became even more isolated and withdrawn. After Chris's death, Melanie Davis was left to raise her two sons on her own. Melanie was a dedicated mother who did her best to provide for Zachary and Josh, but the loss of her husband and the responsibility of being the sole provider took a toll on her. Despite her efforts, she struggled to connect with Zachary, whose behavior became increasingly concerning. Melanie noticed that Zachary was becoming more reclusive, spending most of his time in his room, reading or engaging in solitary activities. He rarely interacted with others and seemed disconnected from the world around him. As Zachary entered adolescence, his mental health began to deteriorate further. He was diagnosed with severe depression, and there were signs that he might be suffering from a more serious mental illness. Zachary started hearing voices, a symptom often associated with psychosis, which can include conditions like schizophrenia. These voices would later play a critical role in the events that unfolded, as Zachary claimed that they urged him to commit the unthinkable. The Davis family dynamics. The dynamic within the Davis household after Chris's death was fraught with tension and unspoken grief. Melanie tried to keep the family together, but the loss of her husband had left a void that was difficult to fill. Josh, the older brother, dealt with his grief by immersing himself in social activities and spending time with friends, which sometimes led him to be away from home. In contrast, Zachary's way of coping was through isolation, which only deepened his psychological issues. Melanie was deeply concerned about Zachary, but struggled to understand him. She sought help from mental health professionals, but the treatment Zachary received was not enough to address the severity of his condition. Zachary's depression and psychosis were like ticking time bombs, and without proper intervention, it was only a matter of time before something catastrophic occurred. The relationship between Melanie and Zachary became increasingly strained. Melanie tried to engage with Zachary, but he often shut her out. He was distant, his emotions a mystery even to those closest to him. While Josh and Melanie had each other to lean on, Zachary was alone in his grief and confusion. This isolation only fueled his growing resentment and anger, emotions that he did not know how to express or process. Despite these underlying tensions, there was no clear indication that Zachary was capable of violence. To outsiders, the Davis family appeared to be coping with their loss as best as they could. There were no major outbursts, no cries for help that could have hinted at the tragedy that was about to unfold. Zachary's quiet demeanor masked the turmoil that was brewing inside him, and by the time anyone realized the depth of his psychological distress, it was too late. The descent into darkness. As Zachary's mental health continued to decline, the voices he heard became more persistent and disturbing. These voices, which Zachary later described as malevolent and commanding, would tell him to do terrible things. One of the most chilling aspects of Zachary's case is the way he described these voices urging him to kill his mother. For a young boy struggling with grief, isolation, and mental illness, these voices became an inescapable force, pushing him towards a path of destruction. Zachary's detachment from reality grew as the voices intensified. He began to believe that his mother was responsible for his father's death, a delusion that likely stemmed from his inability to process his grief in a healthy way. This belief, though completely unfounded, became a central part of his thinking. To Zachary, killing his mother would not only avenge his father, but would also silence the voices that tormented him. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Zachary's behavior became even more alarming. He started to plan the attack meticulously, though no one around him noticed these signs. In his mind, the act of killing his mother was not only justified but necessary. He chose a sledgehammer as his weapon, a tool that symbolized the brute force he believed was required to carry out the act. The selection of the sledgehammer was no coincidence. It was a deliberate choice that reflected the depth of his anger and the severity of his delusions. The planning of the murder was cold and calculated. Zachary waited for the right moment when his brother would be away and his mother would be asleep, vulnerable and unaware of the danger that lurked within her own home. The methodical nature of his planning contradicts the image of a boy in the throes of psychosis, highlighting the complexity of his mental state. While Zachary was clearly disturbed, he was also capable of rational thought, at least to some extent, making the case even more difficult to comprehend. The night of the murder. On August 10, 2012, the Davis family's life was forever altered. The evening began like any other, with no indication of the horror that was about to unfold. Melanie Davis, tired from a long day, went to bed early, unaware that her youngest son had something sinister in mind. Josh was spending the night at a friend's house, leaving Zachary and Melanie alone in the house. Zachary bided his time, waiting until his mother was sound asleep. He retrieved the sledgehammer from the basement, a weapon he had chosen for its lethality. As he stood outside his mother's bedroom, sledgehammer in hand, he paused for a moment, listening to the voices that urged him on. It was a moment of terrifying clarity for Zachary, a point of no return. At around 11 p.m., Zachary entered his mother's bedroom. The room was dark, the only sound being the quiet breathing of his mother as she slept. Without any warning, Zachary raised the sledgehammer and brought it down on Melanie's head with tremendous force. The first blow was enough to cause catastrophic damage, but Zachary didn't stop. He struck her repeatedly, each blow more violent than the last, until her skull was shattered. The brutality of the attack was beyond comprehension. Melanie Davis, the woman who had given birth to Zachary, who had raised him and cared for him, was dead within moments. The sledgehammer, a tool meant for construction, had become an instrument of destruction. The sheer violence of the act shocked even the most seasoned investigators who later examined the crime scene. After ensuring that his mother was dead, Zachary calmly left the room and proceeded to set fire to the house. His plan was to destroy the evidence and, perhaps, to end his own life in the process. However, the fire did not spread as he had anticipated. It caused only minor damage, leaving the house largely intact. Realizing that his plan had failed, Zachary gathered a few belongings and fled into the night, leaving the scene of the crime behind. The aftermath. The news of the murder spread quickly through the quiet community of Hendersonville. Neighbors, friends, and schoolmates were shocked to learn that the quiet, introverted Zachery Davis had committed such a brutal act. The community, which was unaccustomed to such violence, was left in a state of disbelief. Melanie Davis was known to be a loving mother who had done her best to provide for her sons after the tragic death of her husband. That she had been murdered by her own child was almost beyond comprehension. As the investigation unfolded, more details emerged about Zachary's mental state and the events leading up to the murder. Police and forensic experts pieced together the timeline, reconstructing the horrific events of that night. The crime scene itself provided a chilling insight into the level of violence that had been unleashed on Melanie Davis. The sledgehammer used in the attack was found to be covered in blood, with traces of bone and tissue embedded in it, evidence of the brutal force with which Zachary had struck his mother. The investigators also examined Zachary's attempt to set fire to the house. While the fire had not spread as he had intended, it was clear that Zachary had hoped to destroy the evidence of his crime. This act of arson, combined with the premeditated nature of the murder, suggested that Zachary had been methodical in his planning. However, it was also apparent that his actions were driven by the voices he claimed to hear, voices that had taken over his mind and pushed him to commit the unthinkable. The psychological evaluation. Following his arrest, Zachery was subjected to a series of psychological evaluations to determine his mental state and his competency to stand trial. These evaluations were crucial in understanding the depth of his mental illness and the role it played in the murder. The defense team, recognizing the severity of Zachery's psychological issues, argued that he was not in his right mind when he committed the crime and that his actions were a direct result of his untreated mental illness. During these evaluations, Zachery was diagnosed with several serious mental health conditions, including severe depression and psychosis. The voices he heard, which he claimed instructed him to kill his mother, were a manifestation of his psychosis. Experts testified that Zachery's mental state had deteriorated significantly in the years following his father's death, and that he had become increasingly detached from reality. His belief that his mother was responsible for his father's death was identified as a delusion, a false belief that had taken root in his mind and driven him to commit the murder. One of the most troubling aspects of Zachery's condition was his lack of emotional response to the crime. During his interviews with psychologists, he showed little to no remorse for his actions. He spoke about the murder in a matter-of-fact manner, describing how he had planned and carried out the attack. This lack of remorse, combined with his flat affect and disconnection from reality, painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual who was unable to fully comprehend the gravity of his actions. The psychological evaluations also revealed that Zachery had been suffering from these symptoms for several years, and that there had been numerous missed opportunities to intervene. Despite his obvious need for intensive mental health treatment, Zachery had not received the care he needed. This failure to address his mental illness was seen by many as a tragic oversight, one that had ultimately led to the death of Melanie Davis. The trial, Zachery Davis's trial, was closely followed by the media and the public, as it raised difficult questions about the intersection of mental illness and criminal justice. The prosecution and defense presented starkly different narratives of Zachery's actions and the extent to which he should be held accountable for the murder of his mother. The prosecution argued that Zachery's actions were premeditated and deliberate. They pointed to the fact that Zachery had planned the murder for weeks, choosing the sledgehammer as his weapon and waiting for the right moment to strike. The prosecution emphasized that Zachery had the presence of mind to set a fire in an attempt to cover up the crime, suggesting that he understood what he had done and knew that it was wrong. They contended that despite his mental illness, Zachery was aware of his actions and should be held fully accountable for the murder. On the other hand, the defense focused on Zachery's severe mental illness, arguing that he was not in control of his actions at the time of the murder. They highlighted the psychological evaluations that had diagnosed Zachery with psychosis and severe depression, conditions that had gone untreated for years. The defense argued that Zachery's delusions and the voices he heard had driven him to kill his mother, and that he was not capable of understanding the consequences of his actions. They sought to have Zachery placed in a mental health facility rather than being tried and sentenced as an adult. The trial featured testimony from mental health experts who provided insight into Zachery's condition and the impact of his mental illness on his behavior. These experts explained how Zachery's delusions and hallucinations had distorted his perception of reality, leading him to believe that killing his mother was a necessary act. They also discussed the lack of appropriate mental health care that Zachery had received, pointing out that with proper treatment, the tragedy could have been prevented. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury ultimately found Zachery Davis guilty of first-degree murder. The prosecution's portrayal of Zachery as a calculating killer who had planned the murder resonated with the jury, and they concluded that he was responsible for his actions. Zachery was sentenced to life in prison, a decision that sparked a great deal of debate and controversy. The sentencing and public reaction. The sentencing of Zachery Davis to life in prison without the possibility of parole was a harsh outcome for a 15-year-old who had committed a crime under the influence of severe mental illness. The case raised important questions about the treatment of juveniles in the criminal justice system, particularly those with significant mental health issues. Many in the public and legal communities questioned whether Zachery, who was clearly unwell, should have been tried as an adult and sentenced to life in prison. Critics of the sentencing argued that Zachery was a victim of a failed mental health system and that imprisoning him for life was not an appropriate response to his actions. They pointed out that Zachary's condition had gone untreated for years and that his actions were a direct result of his deteriorating mental health. These critics called for greater focus on mental health care and early intervention, arguing that had Zachery received the help he needed, the tragedy could have been prevented. On the other hand, supporters of the sentencing believed that Zachary's actions were too heinous to be excused by his mental illness. They argued that regardless of his condition, Zachery had planned and executed the murder of his mother in a brutal and calculated manner. To them, the life sentence was a just punishment for a crime of such magnitude, and they believed that it sent a strong message about the consequences of violent crime. The debate over Zachary's sentencing highlighted the broader issues surrounding the treatment of mentally ill individuals within the criminal justice system. It also drew attention to the challenges of balancing the need for justice with the need for compassion and understanding in cases involving mental illness. Zachery Davis's case became a symbol of these complex issues, prompting discussions about how society should respond to similar cases in the future. The aftermath and reflections. In the years following the trial, Zachery Davis's case has continued to resonate as a tragic example of the intersection between mental illness and criminal justice. The case has sparked ongoing discussions about the need for better mental health care, particularly for young people who are at risk of developing serious mental health conditions. Josh Davis, Zachary's older brother, has had to carry the weight of this tragedy throughout his life. The loss of both his parents, one to illness and the other to murder, along with the knowledge that his own brother was responsible, is a burden that few can imagine. Josh has tried to move on with his life, but the shadow of what happened will always loom large over him. He has remained largely out of the public eye, choosing to grieve and process the trauma in private. The community of Hendersonville has also struggled to come to terms with the events. The murder of Melanie Davis and the trial of her son left a lasting impact on the town, a place where such violence was rare and unimaginable. For many, the case was a wake-up call to the importance of mental health awareness and the need for support systems for families dealing with mental illness. The case of Zachery Davis also led to calls for reform in the juvenile justice system. Advocates argued that cases like Zachary's should be handled differently, with a greater emphasis on rehabilitation and mental health treatment rather than punitive measures. They pointed to the need for specialized courts and facilities that could better address the needs of mentally ill juveniles, offering them a chance at recovery and reintegration rather than a life behind bars. In the years since the murder, Zachery Davis has remained in prison, where he continues to serve his life sentence. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of untreated mental illness and the tragic consequences that can result when those in need of help are left to suffer in silence. While the case has faded from the headlines, the lessons it offers remain relevant, particularly in the ongoing conversation about mental health and criminal justice. Conclusion. The Sledgehammer Killer case is a story of unimaginable tragedy, a tale of a young boy whose mind was overtaken by illness and who, in his confusion and pain, committed an act of violence that would destroy his family and shock a community.